Welcome back to another episode of Heaven and Healing Podcast. I'm Angela. Today's episode is really special to me because it takes place with my very best friend, Alyssa Linker. So Alyssa and I grew up together. We met when we were 3 years old, and she has spent the past 2 decades praying for my salvation. And so in this episode, we talk about that stark contrast in our upbringing, her Christian background versus my secular background, and how that nuclear family unit with the biblical foundation truly is a necessity in this dysfunctional world when it comes to being in a marriage and raising a family. We talk about the toxicity of feminism and why we should focus on femininity over the feminism culture. With that leads into a topic about abortion and all about marriage. So this episode is my longest yet. It's packed with a lot of stuff. We go all over the place. So definitely give this another listen. And we really hope that you enjoy the episode and that you aren't afraid to speak the truth, even if that means offending somebody. We all have to stand firm on the gospel, on the word of the Lord, before we get worried about hurting people's feelings, okay? Because true love tells the truth. And the most loving thing that you can do for somebody is to spread the good news of the gospel. Enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of Heaven and Healing Podcast. I'm here today with my best friend in the world, Alyssa. So Alyssa and I actually have known each other since we were about 2 or 3 years old. We've known each other so long that I don't even remember meeting her. So this is a really special episode for me personally because a lot of you have heard me talk about her before. She's the one that's been praying for me for 2 decades now. Basically our entire lives, as we're now both 28. And we have a lot of history, and we both grew up very different, although we grew up together because she grew up in a traditional Christian household where I grew up with a lot of love, but no Christianity. And so in hindsight, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the episode to kind of see how both of our lives played out and the differences within that, just based on the foundation of Christianity or lack thereof, is really interesting. And it's really actually crucial to the conversation that we're going to have today. But before we get into that, I'm going to pass it over to Alyssa. So Alyssa, if you could just tell the audience who you are and how you came to know Christ.
Yeah. So as Angela said, oh my gosh, we've been best friends literally since preschool. I kind of have like vague memories of how we met, but oh gosh, it was so long ago. So yeah, my name is Alyssa. I have been a Christian pretty much all my life, ever since I was able to really comprehend what Christ, or really who Christ was and what he meant to me and how he impacted my life. That's, kind of how that went. And I mean, I was very, very blessed to grow up in a Christian household. And I really had a community of people around me who were showing me the way, who were guiding me in just how to live for Christ. My mom, my dad, 2 incredible spiritual leaders, my aunt, my uncle, my grandma, my grandpa, our church family at the time. All of these people, they were like the village that raised me, and they helped instill all of these values in me that I carried throughout my entire life, that really just gave me that solid foundation for me to just continue to grow and grow and grow. I've been a Christian my whole life, and I know Angela has joked about me being this like eldritch Christian being because I've been a Christian for forever, but no, I'm still a baby. I'm still learning. And it's that foundation that I had early on in my life that really, it brought me to where I am now. So that's my testimony, really.
So before we got on the podcast today, I kind of asked you about this, but it's honestly something I never even thought of until today. And I wanted to ask you this because it is interesting for me to talk to people who have always been Christian, because as you know, a lot of my connections these days have been through people with similar stories to mine who have gone through a total 180 and come to Christ in that element. But I was curious for you, was there like a defining moment? Because obviously we go from children who just sort of go along with what our parents are doing, and we grow up in the family and we understand things as our parents understand them, and we accept things as our parents accept them, sort of thing. And then as we get older, we start to have our own opinions, our own voice, and we go through maybe like a rebellion phase of like defying the parent. So was there a point for you? Because looking back, I personally can't remember this, or I wasn't looking for it, I guess. Was there a moment for you where you kind of started to rebel against like the Christianity formula? And if so, was there also a moment where you realized within yourself, like, oh, what I grew up with as actually it? Like I fully accept Christ.
That's an interesting question for someone like me who has been a Christian for so long, because everybody, no matter how long you've been a Christian, everybody goes through seasons of rebellion. It just, we are human, you literally can't avoid it. I can't say that I've ever had a time in my life where I have stepped away from my faith, but I can pinpoint different times in my life where I've certainly done some backsliding. I know, times in my life where I had fallen prey to certain sin, and, as everybody does. And, that damages your relationship with Christ, like it breaks his heart to see that happen. But then I think if I had to look back on it, the moment that it really became real, and I mean like real in the sense that it caused me to think about what I believed and why, I would say that would be my first semester of college, because it was at that point that I was taken out of my, we'll call it a Christian bubble, like I grew up going to church. I went to Christian high school. I went to Christian middle school, like I was constantly surrounded by people who were affirming my own beliefs, who all believed the same thing that I did, that's not a bad thing. But it wasn't until that first semester of college that I actually had my faith tested. And when you have your faith tested, that's when it becomes super real for you. That's when you start to ask yourself questions that you never found yourself asking before. That's really when you get into the apologetics of Christianity. You're defending your faith. And so I would say that was the time where it really it was like rubber met the road. Like, I'm a Christian. Here's why. How do I defend that? And also, why do I believe the things that I believe? And so the only way to do that, the only way to figure those things out, is to really delve deeply into the Word of God. I mean, like on a level that I really hadn't before. And ever since then, that was what I've been doing. Like, I've had this Bible like forever, and it is beat because I use it all the time.
Wow. I didn't know that. But that does make a lot of sense. So on that note, us both growing up in totally different lifestyles, households, I wanted to touch on that because I've been thinking a lot about, and I've told this to you in private, but I've thought a lot about recently, since I've come to Christ, about how we were raised so differently. But both of our parents, like my mom, and if my audience doesn't know already, single mom. My mom, I had so much love that so much I didn't know what to do with growing up. And that. I had my grandmom who just loved me, adored me, and she was great for me. And so I had a really solid unit of love and support, and it was great. Like, I had a great childhood, and I tell you this all the time, but now that I see how our lives have played out, like in the macro, I recognize the gaps growing up for me where I did not have, like, I had a house, but it wasn't like built on a foundation. And then I see the way you turned out, and I use this as an example for my audience to know, okay, Alyssa is like, where Alyssa's at in life is where I want to be in life right now, and where I think a lot of women, honest to God, want to be in life right now. And a lot of that comes from the way she was raised, because she was raised on the foundation of Christ. Whereas myself, I was raised on the foundation of love, 100%, but there was no God component to that. I was not raised on the standards of the Bible. I was not raised to follow the Bible. I was taught by a woman who essentially didn't know better than she knew. And that's really all any of us humans are. We're just people that don't know better than we know. And that's why we need God. That's why we need the structure of the Bible. And there have been times growing up where Alyssa and I have certainly like gotten to points where it could have been like a make or break moment. And that ultimately comes down to the differences in our, at the time, belief systems, how we were raised, what I felt was of value versus what she felt was of value. So I'm going to let you talk about that for a minute, Liz. Could you kind of share with the audience maybe things that you noticed growing up, or noticed in hindsight about the way we grew up, how you were Christian and how I wasn't, and how that did make an actual significant difference?
Yeah. So, wow, there's a lot that goes into that. I mean, aside from the fact that I was raised with a biblical foundation, I was also raised in a home with a nuclear family, which is kind of rare nowadays. Like, it was kind of rare back then. Now it's like super rare, to have a mother and a father in the home who are in complete lockstep with each other in terms of what values they're instilling in their children, what worldview they operate in as far as raising children, So I'll start out, I guess, with biblical womanhood, because that was something that was instilled in me at a very, very young age. And it's something that's carried me through life and gotten me where I am today. And it's something that is vehemently railed against in our modern society, because what is biblical womanhood? Well, to the modern woman, it looks terrible. Like, there's, a whole bunch about it that, it doesn't suit the ego. There's a lot of, it's humbling. It can be humbling. And so, it's like, what is biblical womanhood look like? I've got so many verses here I've actually ran out of sticky notes. So I had everything marked, and then I was like, wow, I ran out of sticky notes. But like, biblical womanhood is not only putting God first. There's an order of operations. It's, God, your husband, and your kids. And so a lot of people, like modern feminism, likes to tell you that, it's all about the self. Like, it's all self. But like, you read these verses in the Bible, particular Proverbs 31 jumps out at me. I mean, like, it's literally it's like 30 verses that talk about, what a good woman looks like. And it's a woman who, she honors her husband. She cares for her household. She's humble. She's gracious. She is giving. She is just, the Bible describes her as more precious than jewels, and a lot of that requires some sacrifice, like biblical womanhood doesn't call us to go and sleep around. It doesn't call us to, live for ourselves or anything like that. It's, there's a lot of self-control that's involved in that, and which doesn't make sense to a lot of people because, again, we live in a society where it's like, go out and like do what feels good, sleep with whoever, do whatever, that kind of thing. I wasn't raised that way. My mom was like my mom and my dad for sure. But in this instance, I'll use my mom as an example. She was totally real with me about all of this stuff. She didn't beat around the bush with anything. She told me how it was. She was like, you don't want to be living this way, and here's why. And not only will these be the consequences, like here's the biblical, here's what's biblical that I can point to teach you. And so that was invaluable. And not only that, and I have a father who never shied away from giving me hard truths, never speaking hard truths into my life, about how the world really is, how certain actions will affect you, how you can absolutely find yourself on the path to self-destruction. Here's how you get there. Here's how you avoid that sort of thing. Like, you know what I'm talking about? So I would say that, the two keys to success in life, having a nuclear family, but also having a nuclear family that wants to help raise kids with a biblical foundation.
I 100% agree. And, when we were little and in our teenage years, I would think sometimes like your parents were too strict or they were too this or that. But it's like, again, it's always in hindsight. They weren't. They were loving, and they were loving by actually drawing boundaries around you because you were at an age where you were not able to draw boundaries around yourself.
No, kids aren't. They can't be left to their own devices. The worst thing that you can do to a child is to deny them boundaries. Like, I can't remember who it was. I think it was Dr. Jordan Peterson who said this, and it was something along the lines of, to give a child a life without boundaries is basically throw them into the ocean without a life raft. They will flounder. And I saw that in my own life. Like I had my parents set hard boundaries for me. And yeah, like when I was a kid, I'd be pissed about it. But like when I look back on it, I'm like, wow, that I could have ended up in a million different bad situations. But because my parents were able to be there to set those hard boundaries for me, I didn't fall into destruction. That's the ultimate goal of a parent, is to prevent your children from falling into destruction.
Mm-hmm. And your parents did a really great job at that. And my mom listens to this, so I want to emphasize that. You didn't do a bad job, Mom. It's not about that. It's not, I'm not here to say my mom did a bad job or that I'm not pleased with how I was raised, because ultimately everything led me here, and I'm grateful, and that is what it is. And we can't undo the past. It's helpful to see this stark contrast of the disorder in my life and the order of yours, because yes, now I've come to Christ, but I'm still only 7 months in, and your dad is the one that put this for me in such a profound way, where he is the one that said, we humans spend a really long time junking up our house. And then what happens when we come to God is that the Lord comes in and he cleans house. He cleans out the junk. And so I'm in that process. I'm still in the sanctification process of the Lord coming in and cleaning out all the junk in my house that I've spent 28 years accumulating by being disobedient, even though it was unknowingly. And with you, there's less junk to clear because of how you were raised. And that's why I keep coming back to that, because I want to just share with the audience the importance of a nuclear family. And that's not even the entire premise of this episode, but it all correlates, because we are talking heavily about feminism with this episode, but it all correlates as one, because when you destroy the biblical concept of womanhood, you inevitably destroy the nuclear family. So we have to get back to this feminism issue, because it is so prominent in our culture. So just like as a little disclaimer, I just wanted to pop in, mention that it's not like I'm in a bad place in my life. It's not any of that. Like there's no ill feelings towards the way I was raised or any of that. It's just, there is a stark contrast. There is a difference between my life and Alyssa's lives, and how we both turned out. Although we were raised side by side, they were two very separate paths. And now they are finally kind of on the same path, because now I am in Christ as well. But the road to get here was very messy, and there's a lot of obstacles for me to clear up along the way still as I go. And so I just wanted to emphasize that this nuclear family, it's not patriarchal, it's not oppressive, it's necessary.
The concept of freedom, the greatest freedom comes with boundary. It's true. How do I explain this? It's like, people have this idea of freedom where it's like, you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whoever, it's like a gigantic moral free-for-all. But what does that lead to? Like when you have freedom in that sense, you hurt yourself, you hurt other people. True freedom has boundary, and there are so many examples of how that plays out in our society. It's crazy. The one thing, feminism coming to mind, since feminism is what we're really going to be discussing today. This idea of like living for yourself, like girl power, all of that stuff. Women have been lied to. Women have been played big time, because what did feminism ultimately achieve? Yeah, we have some good things here and there. Like we can vote, cool. That's nice. But now we're all slaves to careers. Our government decided that now an entire swath of people can now enter the workforce. And so now they just get more tax dollars out of us, and wages have stagnated because there's just an overabundance of people in the workforce. So there's that. And they encourage us to just kind of do away with the nuclear family. Like women end up being just like these slaves to their careers, and they think that that's freedom. They think that that's, like peak life. And it's like, what does that leave you with? It's hard for women who have these, they become so obsessed with their careers. They're told that they can do it all, like you're supposed to be in the society as a woman. You're supposed to have your career, have your family, have your husband, have your kids, right? And that's a whole lot. We're told that we can do it all. Anything you can do, I can do better. We grew up like putting Lisa Frank stickers on our faces that said like girl power and crap like that. Like it was everywhere. We were inundated with it. But what does that look like now? Biblical womanhood calls us to put our families and our husbands first, but everything has been flipped up on its head. And now we put careers first. We put everything else first. And so for the woman who is convinced that she has to do it all, what does that leave her with at the end of the day for her family? She goes out and she works for 8 hours a day, sometimes more, because in this society, women more often than not are forced to work because things are expensive and inflation is through the roof. And that's been happening for a while, but that's an economic discussion for another time. they come home and all they have left to give is a fraction of what they should be giving. The world outside, it takes. And children are left more often than not in daycares being raised by other people. Husbands are kind of just left feeling like their place in the world is off because women have decided that it's their role to take that role, and everything's just all out of whack. And I know in your other podcasts you've touched on this before, and it's very important that there is an order of operations to things. There's a divine order, and it works, and it's God's order. And he knows what the recipe to success is to have families stay together. And we've just decided arbitrarily that we're going to kind of do away with that. And look at what's happened now. Now the divorce rate is at 50%. That's a lot of people. That's huge. Fatherlessness is through the roof. Like, I don't know if you've ever looked up the statistics on like fatherlessness in the home and the things that leads to, but it's tragic. It's like millions of kids find themselves in single family households, and it doubles the rate at which they find themselves committing crimes. It increases the rate of teen pregnancy. It increases the rate of poverty. The list just goes on and on and on. And we have these issues in society, and we sit here and we go, wow, how did that happen? And it's like, the answer's right in front of us. This is where it all went wrong, and this is how we fix it. As simple as that.
You touched on so many good points. And for those just listening, when she said, this is how we fix it, she held up her Bible, and she is correct. What you were talking about with how women are told that you can do it all, you can have it all. I was thinking about my mom, because that's exactly what happened to her when she found out she was pregnant with me. She didn't know where to go or what to do. And not having God, not having that foundation of Christianity, she had the backwash Catholicism from my grandparents, but she didn't want any parts of that.
Yeah.
When she found out she was pregnant with me, she made it a point to pull up her bootstraps, go back to school, start a career, because that's what she was told by the secular world is what would be the best for me, the best for her. It was always work, empowered woman. So I grew up with the empowered woman. I grew up with that all throughout my house, just all the time. And that leads, like you said, to destruction. And I see that with myself. I see that with my mom, because even my mom said to me a couple of weeks ago, we were out shopping for shoes, actually. And she said to me, because I was talking about how there are so many girls, Liz, at my new job, that these are young women. Like, think back to when you and I were 18 and how we acted and still behaved. We were, for those new here, this is not Alyssa and I's first rodeo recording together, because we used to make ridiculous videos on the internet. And we were doing these kinds of things at 18, whereas the girls I see now that are 18, they're not making silly videos online and dressing silly. They are wearing, quote unquote, this is my club dress, is what one of my 18-year-old coworkers said to me. I see these girls and their destruction. I was talking to my mom about this, and my mom said to me, because it was all about their looks, and I said, they're obsessed with their looks and this, that, and it's really sad to see. And my mom said, look where all of that got me, Ange. Look where all that got me. Because my mom was, is a very attractive woman, has always been, and she's always used that to her advantage. Like, it's the clout of like being the attractive woman, which I inevitably took on for myself and wanted the same things. And it's led to a lot of destruction, as with my eating disorder and all that stuff. But my mom said, look where it got me. And the truth is, where did it get her? It got her in there's a lot of confusion within her marriage. There's a lot of confusion within the status where she lives and her job. It's just there's it didn't get her anywhere, is what she was saying. And the same goes for her career. You know, she has the status, she has the money, the retirement and the safety net and the security, which are all things that are important to have, but it's still all perishable. And that's what the whole feminism thing is. It's all grabby hands for the perishable. And it's like you said, we have stuff like from the feminist movement. There have been positives, like, yeah, like you said, we can vote and we have equal pay and equal opportunity in the marketplace. But like, how's your dignity? how's your virtue? And women just being used sexually like never before. You know, that's what the feminism movement has become about, really. It's not even like you said, it's like, oh, we got to have it all. It's only if you want to, you know, there's more of a push to like be sexually empowered than there is to be in a family. So do you want to talk about that for a little bit? Just kind of what the feminism movement has turned into?
So, just for a little context, I grew up with a mom who was a stay-home mom. So that's, you know, I had a really solid example of how that looks in the home, you know, and my parents still to this day, very much together, madly in love with each other. So there's that. But my mom raised two kids. It was me and my brother. And that is hard. Raising kids is no joke. Like, feminism it's funny, you know, the hypocrisy of feminism. They'll like, you know, they'll tell you that, well, you can be whatever you want to be, basically until you decide that you want to be a mom. You know, you want to take on the job, because it is a job, and it is the hardest job, and it is the most important job of raising functional human beings. Okay, we are messy. Human beings are so messy, and as a mom, it's your job to make sure that those kids are functional. And it's crazy how, you know, that is so belittled. It is so belittled. And yet you'll find, funny enough, that in families where it is a nuclear family with a mother at home who has all the time to devote to her kids and to her husband, to maintaining her home, for caring for the needs of her family, those kids end up healthy. They end mentally and physically successful, not impoverished. You know, all of these net benefits to this system. And yet, you know, feminism's like, nah, sorry, you know, like, that's not cool and it's not empowered. You know, I'm going to go my career, and, you know, my cat's my child and my pit bull's my child, you know, that sort of thing. And it's just, it's so selfish. And, you know, you touched on something else too. You know, this whole idea now that like the feminist movement is all about sexual gratification. You know, these kids nowadays, when you and I were 18, we were still weird. Okay. We were still awkward. We were still like coming into our own. We were still kids, you know, like we weren't. I see kids like 14-year-old girls and up, like, who have they've grown up too fast. It's disturbing, honestly. Like, these young girls are now on social media, just kind of counting down the days until they can get their OnlyFans account. Like, it's messed up. And a lot of that has to do with a lack of God in their lives and a lack of fathers in their lives. Because I can tell you right now that if I ever tried to pull any kind of crap like that, my dad would have lost his shit. Like, but that's the role of a father, to have somebody to guide you. And as women, we're very emotional creatures. All right. Like, we're up against so much, you know. not only are we very emotional, we're also very prone to being preyed on, by other men, by even other women who will try to appeal to your emotions, and tell you that you need to look a certain way and be a certain way, and fit in like this and fit in like that. And all of these young girls, they feel so much pressure to fit in, to feel beautiful, to feel like, like they are wanted and worthy. And, they find their identity in that, as opposed to finding their identity in Christ, in what God calls us to be, and it's really tragic. It really is, because I think about all of the young girls out there who have been, put on birth control at such a young age. Like, we could go into that, and it's a horrible and heartbreaking conversation to think about all of the young girls who have just been lied to about that. But yeah, feminism is just, it's done so much harm. It really has.
It really is like it's a sickness in this disease, and it's backwards. It's backwards, because you hear all the time from feminists, the Bible is oppressive, Christianity is oppressive, traditional Christianity is oppressive, that word, oppressive. And, I don't want anything to do with your God that oppresses me. So before we get into kind of the issues with the secular world and the secular movement, could you kind of start by debunking the biblical myths of that dialogue, that oppressive narrative?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's one you'll hear that a lot from feminists who are like, oh, you fundamental Christian conservatives, like, you guys just hate women and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, the Bible does nothing but subjugate women. And it's like, actually, though, if you read the Bible, which most of these people haven't, you'll find the complete and utter opposite. The Bible has nothing but love for women, and it outlines how men are supposed to treat women. It's all over the place. It's like, I have my notes here, and like, I've got everything from the Old Testament to the New Testament, like Ephesians 5:25 comes to mind, where men are called to love their wives as Christ loved the church. And so what does that look like? What did Christ do for the church? And when I say the church, I mean his people, his body, the body of Christ. We are the church as believers. What did he do? Well, he freaking sacrificed himself on a cross. So if that's not love, I don't know what is. And if men are called to love their wives in that way, if Christ himself calls men to love their wives in that way, there's no room for oppression. That doesn't exist in this model. It just doesn't exist. 3:7 calls husbands to live with your wives in an understanding way. Love them, cherish them. It's, do not be harsh with them. All of these things. Where's the one? It's like my favorite. Give me a moment to just sort of flip through my Bible and look for it real quick.
As you do that, I have a couple of those written down too. I have like Genesis 2 verses 20 to 24, Proverbs 19:14, and it all highlights women. And by the way, these verses that we mentioned, they'll all be in the show notes that you can look at later. They all mention, women and wives that are seen as venerated partners, not anything less than their husband. They are equal partners, and they are cherished companions to their husbands. And they're not seen as merely slaves or pieces of furniture. And I wanted to really quick compare that to ancient paganism, because I know some about that too, where if you look at the mythology, like Greek, for example, you would think that with their like goddess worship, that this was actually the true face of what it means to liberate a woman, as opposed to Christianity. But the thing is, with those deities and those worship temples, a lot of those were actually like served by sacred prostitutes. So prostitutes were the ones that were like kind of serving these organizations, and that led to ceremonies that included things like erotic fertility and like orgies and perversion and even human sacrifice. And like that is actually oppressive. And that paganism, that is what ultimately like Western culture branched into. And so it's totally backwards. It's not, and this isn't like a conversation about paganism versus Christianity, but it just goes to show that the narrative of the Bible being oppressive could not be more false. It is inherently false. And like you said, a lot of these people haven't read the Bible. That's another thing that feminism has actually bred, is this lack of reasoning, this lack of knowledge, this lack of sense, where somebody can't even pick up a Bible and take maybe an hour or two to skim through it. And you would find in that hour or two that, wow, this does actually exalt women. But people don't do that. People don't do that with anything. They don't look at facts. They don't look at statistics. They don't look at data. They won't read the Bible. And that comes from feminism as well. It's a direct result of that kind of entitlement, selfish, feeling-based mindset, that ideology.
And you know what? Like I said, Google's free. Like you can look all of this stuff up, but people won't, because they want to just be mad. And like one of the things that they like to talk about, or try to roast Christians on is, like if you're a Christian and you're a woman, like your lot in life is basically to just be an incubator for kids. And no, first of all, no, that's not true at all. And I'm going to go back to Proverbs 31 because it's incredible. And I won't read the entire thing, but I really would encourage anybody, any woman, who has any doubts, who's listening, who wants to know what biblical womanhood really looks like, to read Proverbs 31, starting at verse 10 and ending at verse 31. It starts out, "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies." So right there, you've got the Bible telling you women are precious. We are to be cherished. Our worth is like far beyond any earthly or material thing. And it goes on to say that the heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. And it goes on in verse 13 all the way down to describe how she honors her husband and honors her family and works. That's another thing that they like to tell you, is that like, oh, you Christian women, like you're stuck in your houses and you can't do anything, and you just have to be incubators for kids. But that's not true. And it goes on to talk about how she works in the home. She honors her house and her household, her husband, also by having a job. She does all of these things to make money for her household. So again, the whole point is that there has to be a balance that has to be struck. A woman has to put her family and her husband and her children first. That's not to say that she's just limited.
Just a really quick pause in this episode to remind you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you listen to watch, and to please give it a 5-star rating and written review to help spread the good news and get this into more people's ears. People will hear that and say, well, so what? The whole point of a woman is just to honor her husband. But going back to what you said before, no, it's there's a balance. There's, husbands are called to honor their wives the way Christ honors the church, like you just said. So that's sacrificial love. It doesn't get more unconditional than that. So it's not like the Bible is just calling forward this virtue of women. It's calling it forward in men as well. And that seems to be lost on people that want to just insist that the Bible is this patriarchal tool used to completely annihilate women's rights,
subjugate us. Like that's not it at all. It's so sad that people have that idea of the Bible, because it's just so not accurate at all. It's really lost on people how much love husbands are called to give their wives, and how much love wives are called to give their husbands. It's nothing but love. But you know what? Sometimes love requires some self-sacrifice. And so that's what gets people, that's what turns them off, because they want to be slaves to their own ego. They don't want to self-sacrifice, because what does that mean for them? That means that maybe sometimes they have to do a hard thing. Maybe sometimes they have to do something that just kind of grinds their gears, and people just aren't willing to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it sucks, but like that's the give and take in any relationship, not even just a marriage. Those are friendships. Friendships call forth the need to self-sacrifice sometimes, or to speak hard truth into somebody's life, or have certain standards for one another to keep one another in check. That's it's in every relationship, to more or less degrees depending on the relationship, but all of those things are ultimately present there.
100%. And it's like we talked about in the beginning with boundaries. It's like drawing that line around out of love. And that reminds me of like 2 years ago. Do you remember on Christmas when I posted that picture on Instagram of basically my entire backside? I was like in lingerie. And yeah. This was a year before I got saved, actually, that this happened. So I posted this very, very, I don't even know the word for it, provocative image. I posted a very provocative image on Instagram, as I used to do a lot. And it was on Christmas. So I thought it was, I had a Santa hat on. I was like, oh, this is cute. I want to be honest that there was a part of me, and I didn't know where that was coming from. Mm-hmm. I assumed that it was just like, oh, it's like my ancient roots of being oppressed as a woman that wants me not to do this. But actually it was like a little Holy Spirit nudge that was like, you don't need to post that. I felt weird about it, but I did it. And when I did it, obviously I got so much praise for it that everyone was like, oh, this is hot. This is that. This is great. You, Alyssa, were the only person that was like, hey, this isn't cool that you posted this. Like, my brother can see this. My fiance, who was Matt was your fiance at the time. My fiance can see this. I can see this. And I don't think you should be doing this. And I was so mad at you. I was so upset that you were trying to put me in a box and like be this like boring person, that you didn't want me to express myself. But the truth is, you were being a friend. You were telling me the truth. And I was not willing to receive that truth because it directly collided with what I wanted. And that is the biggest thing with feminism. It's what I want.
It was so hard for me to articulate because you were in a much different place. It wasn't about the fact that it wasn't just about the fact that other people, like my dad was literally sitting right next to me when that happened. And I was like, oh my God. So I, it was more like I was trying to explain to you that your worth was not defined by your body. You were in a place and that I could see where you were struggling with your self-image, and my heart broke because I was like, my God, she's so much more than this. She's worth so much more to this. This image that you're putting out there is not meant for other people to see because it's not cheap, you know? And like, that's another thing that's really lost on women, you know, something that feminism has really encouraged women to do is to put themselves out there in that light. You know, they'll talk about how they don't want to be objectified by men, but they go out and they put themselves out there in a way that they objectify themselves. And they don't realize that what they're putting out there is, it's worth something, but to give it to everybody is to cheapen it, you know? It's kind of hard. I hope I'm explaining that right. It's something that I was always taught, something that I know to be true. And because the Bible calls that forth in us as women to be humble, to be chaste. You know, it tells us here in the Bible that, you know, we have worth, we have immense worth. And to just throw that out there for everybody and anybody, you know, that it cheapens it, you know? Like, I had somebody once kind of give me an analogy of this using like cars, and it's kind of crude, but it's a good analogy. You know, it's like, as soon as you drive a car off the lot, it depreciates in value. You know, and then like, once you drive a car for like a few years, it's pretty beat. So I'm not like, again, that's a crude analogy, but it fits, you know. It's just kind of a harsh one, you know. So anyway, back to my point. You know, we're not defined. Our worth is not our bodies. It's not how we look. Our worth is in Christ. You know, our worth is what makes us children of God, you know. And all of these things, beauty, and, you know, these bodies that we have, you know, they're gonna pass away, you know, they're gonna deteriorate. All of this is all temporary, but our souls are not. And so that's the most important thing about us.
It's just so interesting. And I understand it. And it's really cool for me to be on this side now, because I was on the other side of like everything, every political issue, cultural issue, religious issue, belief issue, everything. I was on the other side. So I see all of it. And it's just so interesting to me to see in hindsight how I was such a hypocrite. And I think the reason it's hard for us to articulate this is because the concept in and of itself is paradoxical, right? It's like empowerment. Don't objectify me, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to objectify myself and call it empowerment. It's so paradoxical that it's hard to explain, because it's hard to conceptualize, because it doesn't make sense. So how can you make sense of something that doesn't make sense? The actions, the ideologies do not make actual sense, because it's like a house of cards, you know. You can't be out here saying that, you know, you're worthy, you're this, you're that, but that worth is determined on your like count, or that worth is determined on how, you know, your body count, maybe not your like count, but your body count. But then you want to say at the same time, well, my worth actually isn't defined by those things, which is why those things don't matter. And yet you're emphasizing their importance. So my heart breaks for the feminist movement, because there's clearly, it's mass confusion. It's absolute confusion, and it's disorder. And how many times can we say it? That disorder comes from not being in God's order. It's actually heartbreaking how confused and lost these women are. And then they'll wag their finger at women like you and I and say, you're wrong, you're the problem, you're this, you're that, and get really nasty and aggressive.
Yeah.
And as I used to be, and offended. We can't be afraid to be offended, first of all. Like that's a huge part of this whole conversation is people are so afraid of being offended or of offending that they won't tell the truth. But the thing about the Bible and why people don't like it and why people will say is that it's oppressive is that it does tell the truth. It tells the truth and people don't like it because you can't be neutral with any of these biblical concepts because they are so radical. So you either got to pick one or the other, and you're literally forced to do so. And so people, when it doesn't coincide with what they're in their feeling state, whatever they want, then they'll just reject it.
Yeah, it's true. We have put being offended on a pedestal. We have offending someone has become the greatest crime that you could commit in this society. And it has caused us to absolutely stagnate. We can't have these conversations in public circles anymore, because people, now at this point, people are beyond just being offended. You've got people who are offended and then they decide to act out on it. Like, people can't even control themselves anymore. Like, you'll get verbal abuse. You'll get physical abuse depending on, the environment that you're in. I can't even begin to tell you how many times as a Christian over the years, I've gotten like horrible, like just threats and comments and all of these things. Like, my favorite one is that I have internalized misogyny because I'm a Christian woman. That's always been my classic fave. And I clearly, like, I must hate myself and like horrible things. And it's like, no, dude, I'm good. Like, I'm good. I've always been good. But people can't wrap their heads around it because they're so busy trying to fill this void. And this is another thing that you've talked about. You did an entire episode on it, that God-shaped void, that God-shaped hole in everybody's hearts. Everybody's trying to fill it with literally everything but God. They will fill it with sex. They'll fill it with drugs. They'll fill it with alcohol. They'll fill it with, you name it. They're trying to, fill that hole with it. And what is it? It's all just stuff it's just arbitrary stuff. It's none of it's based on anything long lasting. It's always just a little temporary fix, but that's the very nature of it. You're never going to get that fulfillment with things that are temporary. You're only going to get fulfillment with things that are eternal. And what is eternal? God's love. The Bible tells us to fix our eyes not on the things of this earth, but fix our eyes on things that are above. And that's the only way that we're going to properly navigate this plane of existence that we're on. That's crazy, with all of these crazy people and with an enemy out there, a very, very real enemy out there who wants to see our destruction. He looks at feminism, Satan looks at feminism and he laughs. He's like, ha, gotcha. Because look at everything that's come of it. Like, now we have this abortion issue again. Now it's like a whole mainstream thing again with the end of Roe v. Wade. And just the evil that I have seen manifest in people with this whole thing that's just taken place is so alarming. It's so alarming. Before we even started this podcast, you had sent me a post on Facebook. What do you remember the wording of that post? How it described children in the womb, something along the lines of like them being, just parasitic, equating them to cancer.
A parasitic attack on the body. They called pregnancy a parasitic attack on the body.
That's it. And this is how we've this is how we've regressed. Basically, it's so regressive. It's not even to now we're at the point where we're viewing children, viewing lives, viable lives, by the way, as parasites. No better than cancer. And Satan's just laughing. He's having a field day with it.
Absolutely, because you want to talk about oppression. Excuse me, what is more oppressive than actually devaluing a woman's body to the point of calling the extraordinary, unique gift of childbearing that we only have as women, to devalue that as a parasite? You want to talk about being oppressed? What kind of language is that? Where the single most beautiful thing about womanhood is the miracle of life.
Mm-hmm.
As a parasite, you want to equate that to being a parasite.
Yeah, much. And I'm pretty sure the last time we as people, as human beings, have seen such such disregard for the lives of children was when like they were sacrificing children to Moloch in the Bible. It's like, you people don't see what you're doing. There's millions of kids, millions of babies who have been aborted. That's, oh my gosh, to think about the lives that could currently be.
60 million.
That's it.
60 million.
Yeah, 60 million. And, all lost because why? Arbitrary reasons. You'll hear all sorts of arguments where, they'll try to argue that, well, like rape, incest, the mother's life is in danger. They'll use like 1% of abortion cases to justify the other like 99% of abortions that take place due to the fact that women are just, they just arbitrarily want to get rid of that pregnancy. They just want to terminate it. Why? I don't know. Maybe they don't feel like they make enough money, or maybe they just weren't responsible. That's usually how it goes, but that's how they justify it. And it's horrendous. And you know what? In the spirit of that, I really want to point to two particular instances in the Bible where God tells us exactly how he feels about babies, about human beings formed in his image. And the first one is Jeremiah 1, verse 5, where it tells us that God knows us before he even formed us. They're valuable. Those lives are valuable. Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16, it outlines how God takes an active role in our creation. Let me pull that up real quick, because it's such a beautiful set of verses rather. And bear with me a moment, because Psalms is like a huge book. 138, 13, 30, 139. For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret, and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, And in thy book, in all members were written which continuance were found, as yet there was none of them. How precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God, how great the sum of them. And I read that, and I can't imagine how people could try to justify anything less.
The thing with, I didn't even plan on getting into the abortion thing until later, but we'll circle back around to other stuff. The thing with the abortion stuff is that this has really, this is the first thing that's happened since I've been saved where I'm really seeing how very real the toxicity of feminist culture and just the secular world has really impacted our culture and our world. And it's been really, really heartbreaking, again, to use that word. It's been heartbreaking to witness, because I used to be very, like, you know, pro-choice, you know, the woman should do what she wants with her body, XYZ, because it sounds like the compassionate perspective, like saying that out loud, like, oh, a woman should have the right to choose. Oh, okay. That sounds like it really makes sense. The thing is, it's not your body anymore. There's a life there. And for me to say that is not Christian. It's actually just scientifically true. It's alive. That baby is alive in the womb. Now, to take it from the biblical perspective, an unborn child is the first person that actually acknowledged the presence of Christ, because, you know, the baby leapt in the womb when Mary was there. It was the first person to praise the Lord, an unborn baby, because it leapt in the womb, because it could. And it's just, you know, that's from a biblical perspective, because I do see a lot of Christians that are very silent on this topic because it's so controversial, but I don't see how murder is controversial. But that's like, from a Christian, as a Christian, how can you not be just disgusted with this entire thing?
Secular standpoint, you know, we as American citizens were guaranteed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, those are our rights. But those are pretty hard to do when your mom decides to arbitrarily just, like, I don't know, one-shot you in the womb because she'd rather make $60,000 a year making PowerPoints instead of raising you. I don't know. But, you know, the whole thing with Roe v. Wade, you know, it was garbage law to begin with. There's a lot of misconceptions about it. It never guaranteed the right to abortion. What it did guarantee was a right to privacy. So there's, you know, there's that.
Actually, not to cut you off, it's actually on video as well. And this comes back to a point that I made at the beginning, where I said people aren't willing to open their Bible for 2 hours and see that it exalts women the same way that people aren't willing to do some research and understand what it is they believe in and why they believe in it. You can find on the internet right now proof that Roe lied about being raped. She admits that she lied about it. So the very law, or the very reason that set this law into motion, is a fallacy. It's false. It was a lie, and she admitted it herself. So you are standing on the backbone of a lie, is what you're doing. Not only murder, but a lie. So it's just, and I know we get passionate when we talk about these things, but there's the humanness in us, but it's like, it's just evil. Like you said, it is evil works, and Satan is laughing at us.
You can't even have an honest conversation, because it's such a volatile subject that I've watched people just fly off the handle at the drop of a hat if you even try to have this conversation with people. Like, for example, you know, I was in a conversation with a woman who she was losing her mind because here in the state that I now live in, New Hampshire, they determined that It is now law that abortion is legal up until, I believe it's 27 weeks. You have 27 weeks to figure that out. That's like 6 months. And even that wasn't enough for people. Like, you listen to these people talk about it, and it's like, they talk about it like it's not enough until you're able to just like kill your toddler, like the way that people lose their minds about it. And it makes you wonder where they're at mentally to even like draw that conclusion. It's really sick. It really is. And now people are protesting about it in states where it will remain legal. So again, people don't have to totally lose their minds about it. But it's such a volatile subject. It really is.
You had mentioned that, people want to play on the rape and the incest, which, for the record, we're not denying how horrific that is or how tragic it is, because it is. And people play on that. And the thing is, and this, again, it all ties in together, comes back to women being emotional creatures. The powers that be know the Bible because they know the enemy. They know biblically and just evidentially how emotional we are. We react from our feelings. That's how we operate as women. We are soft. And so they use that to their advantage and to our disadvantage. They, like you said, women are being played with the feminist movement, and that ties right into abortion. Women are being played. They are using your emotional capacity to literally hold you in the bondage of their ideologies. That is ultimately a eugenics project, because that's all abortion ever was and still is, and also puts more money in their pockets. So the rape and incest, absolutely horrific. Statistically, though, less than 1% of reported abortions come from that. People are using abortion as birth control because they don't want to have a baby. And the greatest irony with this is that people want choices. They want choices, but they do not want the consequences of those choices. And that comes back to just, oh, well, you know what? If I want to wear a spaghetti strap shirt, I should be able to do that because I'm not responsible for some dude looking at me. No, you're not. But the thing is, you want the choice, but you don't want the consequence. You don't want the guy staring at you, but you just want to do what you want because you want to do it because you want to do it. And that's the same thing with abortion. And it's actually so, I just keep using the word heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because the selfishness, it's utterly selfish. And it ties back into this whole concept of worth, because inherently it comes down to believing that your worth is totally just wrapped up in yourself and whatever it is you need or want or desire. And that's sad. It's really sad, because if that's all you can see is just what's in the mirror, you can't see beyond that mirror, then what are you doing? And I say that with love, because it's like, what are you truly happy is what I'm saying. Is, are you happy? Because as Alyssa said earlier, how you mentioned that people want to come at you and say that you have internalized misogyny, which is something I used to think about you. Even though I always loved you, I would think that to myself, like, she's internalized the misogyny because of Christianity. The thing is, like, no, you're not internalizing misogyny. You are just being honest.
And that's how I was raised. I was raised to just look at things objectively and honestly.
Objectively.
People want a consequence-free life. That's basically what they want. And as far as the topic of abortion goes, it's like women forgot that the function of sex is to procreate, and then when they get hit with that consequence, they're like, oh, got to get rid of that, and it's terrible. Like, I think back on what does the Bible say? You always got to come back to that. Like, what does the Bible say about this? And it says that this could all be really easily avoided if you get married. The institution of marriage is wonderful, like Hollywood, society, everybody, they will tell you that marriage is nothing but bondage and that it is just, it's just something that you do and it's disposable. It's either not worth it or it's disposable. People will tell you all sorts of things about marriage, but what they fail to realize is that the institution of marriage is one of the greatest protectors of women and children ever. Women wouldn't have to worry about getting pregnant and not knowing what the hell to do about it if they were married. Instead, what we get is we get pushed birth control. Here's some birth control so you can just go live a consequence-free life. And then, if that doesn't work, well, then you can just go to a clinic and continue to live a consequence-free life. But in reality, there are actual consequences to all of those things. There are consequences to birth control. There are consequences to getting an abortion. And that's one of the things that nobody wants to talk about, is that having an abortion is one of the psychologically and physiologically worst things that can happen to a woman. It will damage you. It will damage you. It will affect your future fertility. It will affect your mental health. For all of these people who like to say, you hate women if you don't support their right to choose, nobody wants to consider what that consequence of that action actually looks like for women who have gone through that. And, as a sidebar to that, for anybody who's listening to this, who has gone through that tragedy, because it is a tragedy, it's not something to laugh about. People will tell you that it's like, oh, celebrate your abortions and stuff like that. It's ridiculous. Most women who have gone through that don't want to celebrate that. It was a horrible choice that they felt like they had to make. And it was one that they made, more often than not, feeling like there was no other choice to be made. There is forgiveness in that. There is forgiveness in that. Okay. You're not damned for that. But for the woman out there who is considering getting an abortion, there are other options. There just are. There are so many people and so many resources out there willing to help that, it's not the only option, but people will push it like it is. And it's horrible.
It's encouraged even because, that a lot of these businesses now these corporations have been announcing that they will actually fund the travel assistance of one of their employers or employees that wants to have an abortion, but they won't extend your maternity leave. So,
because it's more expensive. It's more expensive to have a woman on maternity than it is to have them abort their child. So, for all of these people out there who have been basically scammed into thinking that these businesses are being super altruistic and they're not. They're out their own monetary gain. And
it's all monetary. And I don't want to get away from this point because I know if I don't mention it, somebody will. The ectopic pregnancy thing, you and I talked about this like a week or so ago. And then I just been digging all week on this. The laws, if anybody tries to come at you, this is for anybody listening or watching, if anyone wants to come at you about how these abortion laws are going to endanger women, I want you to make them show you the legislation for that because they can't do it. You know why? Because it doesn't exist. Because the legislation is clear. The legislation is very clear that this does not include medical emergencies, anything that endangers the mother or the fetus. So that is again, it's an emotional, it's a hook line. It's all it is.
Literally just meant to scare you. And I can tell you, because I've done the research on this too. Again, less than 1% of abortion cases occur due to medical emergencies. It's not common. With all of the technological advancement that we have, women will they'll have you thinking that it's like, you know, we're like living back in the freaking 1700s where, you know, you were like, everybody was just left and right dropping dead from being pregnant. It's not the case. And it's meant to scare people. That's all it is.
It's all it is. And I just pray that people start to see that. In lieu of recent events, so if you're listening to this in real time, it's July 2022, and in lieu of these recent events with the Roe v. Wade being overturned, I really, really pray that people can start to see that they have those scales removed and they can start to really see all of this for what it is and how it all is just this big domino effect, and it's this whole cesspool of just disease of godlessness, and that's really what it is. And the fact is, you know, it all does come back to godlessness, because those heinous people that are responsible for the less than 1% of rape and incest victims that do have those abortions, those heinous people that did that, if they had Christ in their hearts, they wouldn't be out raping people or trying to sleep with their family members. Because when you have Christ on your heart and you're a new creation, to sin, especially, there's something like that's like unfathomable kind of sin that's not there. It's not on the radar. This is a godlessness issue, all of it: abortion, feminism, fatherlessness, everything. It's all godlessness, which is why this podcast will never run out of topics to talk about, because everything is a result of godlessness, and it's everywhere. And I just don't know how people can't see it anymore. I really don't. And how you had mentioned, kind of got sidetracked from that point where you're talking about internalized misogyny and people are telling you like, or you're saying you're good and people are saying, no, you're not. It's ironic because, again, to compare the ways that we grew up and the ways that we have behaved throughout our 20s, I have not been good. Like, I've been very, you know, I've been flaunting myself. I've been really, really tempted by the sin of lust and pleasure, and just the notion of like wanting to sleep around, like really wanting that for myself, Liz. Like this time last year, I was feeling oppressed because I never had a hoe phase. And that was something that I actually said out loud to somebody, like to my partner. And I think about how that is actually internalized hate, not you sitting there saying, hey, you know, there's an issue with this kind of stuff. No, internalized hate is the woman who wants to actually use her body to feel something from a dude, to feel something from attention, to feel something at all. That is somebody who hates herself, and it's disguised as self-love. Somebody that gets an abortion, that's not an act of self-love. Like, can we just be really real about that? That's not an act of self-love. It's a desperate attempt to make yourself whole. And that's all this is, all of it.
That's on the hoe phase thing. You are certainly not the only woman to ever express that desire, which to this day, I don't really know where that comes from. I've also had other friends of mine go, you know, like they'll get out of a relationship with someone and they're like, yeah, I should go through a hoe phase. And I'm like, why? Like, who said who? Where does that come from? And it's, you know, we're the Sex and the City generation. We grew up with this idea pushed on us that like sex has no consequences. And that women are just like men, and that, you know, like we can just go out and just sleep with whoever we want, whenever we want, however many people that we want, and there's just going to be zero consequences to that, and nothing can be further from the truth. And it's sad that women find that out like later on in life. You know, I'm seeing a trend now in articles where women now who are reaching their like mid to late 30s are realizing that like, oh my gosh, I basically wasted all of my 20s partying and, you know, just being a slave to my own desires. And now I'm like in my 30s, all I have is my cat and my career, and nobody wants to marry me because, you know, you're in your late 30s. And at that point, it's like things get a little bit harder for women, which, you know, that's another thing that women have been lied to about, our biological clock hitting the wall. That can be a whole other conversation if you want to go into that. But yeah, and who is the most miserable demographic in the West? It's women. And they've documented, you can go on, Google it, like the most miserable demographic of women or of people in the West is women, because like women are the majority of people who are on antidepressants. They're the majority of people who are taking sleeping pills, you know, like all of this stuff. And where does that come from? It comes from a lack of God. It comes from a lack of guidance. It's simple as that.
It really is. Like it is that simple. And it is just, it really is, it's heartbreaking. I keep saying that, but it's heartbreaking to just see this, because I was in it too. You know, I'm feeling what you mentioned actually recently. You know, I'm 28, but I'm feeling like I wasted like 10 years just putzing around, just being a goddess. Like I know I was never a goddess. I was a lost girl who needed God desperately. And I always wonder what would have happened if I had found God 10 years ago as opposed to now, because I can only imagine what a better place I'd be. What better place I would be in. And again, that's not to say I have regrets. Can't change anything. This is all God's plan. I'm very grateful that he left the 99 to come after me for some reason. But it's what you said. There's a reality to that people don't talk about, that feeling of, oh, I actually really want those things for myself. I want a family. I want to be a monogamist. Like I want to just be a woman that, funny enough, is described in the Bible. And even actually, you mentioned Sex and the City. The creator of Sex and the City actually said that recently, that she regrets.
Oh yeah.
Isn't that insane?
Yeah, I know. It's wild. You know, she came out and she said that she regretted all of it. She regretted living that lifestyle that she that she pushed, because in the end it was self-destructive. You know, like sin is wrapped up in that pretty package like that. You know, it's like, you know, it could feel good in the moment. It feels good temporarily. But it leaves you a wreck. It really does. And so it's this whole like lifestyle is pushed on women, where it's like, you know, your young 20s that's that time of your life where you're a goddess. You know, like your ultimate goal is to be desired. And your ultimate goal is to just pursue self-pleasure, you know? I know, you know, you've talked about that a lot, you know, having experience in the New Age, where the New Age movement really, it really pushes that, you know, like living your own personal truth, you know, living your own, you know, being a goddess, being, you know, deifying yourself, you know. And now we live in such a gynocentric society, that women find themselves older, hitting that wall and not knowing what hit them, because nobody ever told them that we have this window of opportunity and then it closes. And people will say, well, that's unfair. Like, you know, like, what about men? And I can tell you that men go through that same exact thing, just in a different way. So like women start out with value. Like we start out, well, to be very, it's just to speak in very plain terms, we start out with sexual value, in the sexual marketplace, up in our 20s and everything like that. Like we have immense sexual value, whereas men start out worthless and have to work their way up. And we go through the same thing, just in a different time frame and in a different way. It's like you get these women out there who, like, you'll see them in memes all the time. Like they make jokes about them all the time, where it's like, the woman she's got like 5 kids from like 5 different dudes. And she put out a Tinder profile where she's like, well, I'm looking for a dude who's like 6'2", he makes X amount of money and he drives this kind of car, right? And it's like, ma'am, you like 5 whole people came out of you. Like, that's not how that works, but then you get women who will look at guys who are broke and they have nothing to their name and they have nothing going for them and they're not successful. They haven't conquered anything. And they're like, ew, I want nothing to do with you. So it goes both ways. But men are told that. Men understand that. Women don't understand that because we've been lied to by this, we're the Sex and the City generation. You can have it all, you can do it all, and you've got all the time in the world. And then reality kicks in. And suddenly women are like, oh, I'm in my late 30s and dudes are looking to marry women in their 20s. So that's kind of just the harsh reality of that. But it's a reality that women need to be made aware of so they don't make these mistakes and waste their lives. Because you see so much of it. Women are just wasting their precious time and their precious lives. And it makes people miserable. It really does. So bottom line is biblical womanhood. It's peak womanhood. And it's not oppressive to exist within those boundaries, to follow that guideline. It's what's going to give you happiness and freedom. I'm 28 years old and I'm married. And that's like all I ever wanted to be. I wanted to be a wife. I wanted to be a mom. And I'm so blessed because I followed that outline: how to be a good woman, how to be a biblical woman, how to attract a good, God-fearing man. And I did it. And I had my parents to thank for that. But more than that, I had God to thank for that.
Amen. And that's exactly to the point at the beginning of the episode where I said, Alyssa's the kind of woman that I is where I want to be in life, and where I really believe that all women want to be. And us speaking on this truth of how women, when they're older, come to realize that they've wasted their time is evidence to that. And that's even goes back to that conversation I had with my mom in the shoe store. Same thing with her. She gets that, she's, if I told my mom's age on my podcast, she would wring my neck, but she's at an age where she's experiencing that very harshly. And it's not because she missed her window to have children, obviously, but she feels like she missed her window to really have like a healthy nuclear family. And there might be truth to that, but it's the harsh reality of what a life bred and breathed with Christ looks like versus one that does not. And that's the crux of everything. And I mean, I wish I had been raised that way, but that's now why I've become obsessed with wanting to raise kids within that, within those guidelines, because this world, like you said earlier, is so dysfunctional. And the most important responsibility of a parent is to raise functional people in a world that is dysfunction. And that is Christ. He is function.
Yeah.
He is order. And that's what we need to bring our kids up into. They don't need to be read to by drag queens. They need to understand biblical context. And the thing is, I know a lot of what we may have said on here could sound offensive or sound mean, but I don't care about being offensive as much as I care about speaking what is true. And so that's just what it is.
Great words of Ben Shapiro. Facts don't care about your feelings, and they don't. They just don't. You know, there's a proper way to live, and there's a proper way to find yourself in ruin. You know,
and there's an irony to it. Sorry to cut you there, but there's an irony to it. Would you agree that we hear that it's oppressive, it's oppressive, it's oppressive, it's oppressive, but it's like, what could be more oppressive than actually feeling like such a slave to your addictions, feeling like such a slave to your sins? Like me, for instance, feeling like I was literally out of control to the point where I felt like I needed to get a new job because I couldn't control my temptation of lust. That is oppression, to feel like you can't control yourself. And that's exactly what feminist culture is. It actually promotes the act of being out of control and then paints it as you're in control by acting out of control. So could you talk about self-control for a little bit and what that really means and what that looks like and why it is actually liberating?
Yes. I will absolutely use myself as an example. And I'll go back to the hoe phase. You know, this whole idea that like you need to go out and you need to sleep with a whole bunch of people and like that has no consequence. And when it does, you know, I was raised, you know, like my mom told me all of this stuff. She was very candid, very open about how that can lead to destruction and also how that can make you I mean, it's a harsh truth, and it sounds so strange to say this rather in, you know, in our society, which is very feminist. But as a woman, the very hard truth is that if you go out and you do that, you limit yourself to, you know, with the type of men that you actually want to end up with in a functional marriage. You limit yourself because a man is going to look at you and see that aspect of your life and go, she would not make a good wife. Why? Because she has no self-control, you know, and that's risky. That's risky because especially in this day and age where you have faultless divorce, where, you know, a woman can take a man to court, divorce him, and then just like take half his shit and the kids. Like no man wants to gamble on that, you know. That's a hard truth. It just is, you know, in the same way that women don't want broke dudes who are, you know, who have all these different vices and stuff like that. You know, men also don't want that kind of thing in women. You know, we hold each other to certain standards. You know, there are consequences to those, you know, to breaking that standard.
Another quick pause in this episode to ask that if you do feel called to do so, please consider donating to the Heaven and Healing podcast ministry, where 100% of the proceeds do go directly to supporting and maintaining this podcast. The link for that is in the show notes, or you can find the link for the donation box in my bio. God bless, and thank you so much if you do donate. So yeah, we've talked about a lot, and I totally agree with you, everything that you just said about how we hold each other to standards, and that's not cruel or unusual. That's honestly just like the condition of being human, and it goes back to what we said at the beginning about boundaries. It's the same thing with the standards that we hold in relationships. And I always like to kind of relate that, just like as a sidebar, I like to relate that to how God has standards as well, because we always talk about like unconditional love and blah, 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 acceptance. But unconditional love is not unconditional tolerance. Like the same way you wouldn't like approve of your partner, no matter how much you love them, just honestly like letting themselves go, like quitting their job and just loafing on the couch all day long. Like that's not something that you can tolerate from someone that you expect to provide for you.
Absolutely not.
So that's, obviously much different parameters because it's God, but God holds standards as well. And that's why the Bible has such boundaries.
And to hold those boundaries requires self-control. And I think that was what we were discussing earlier, is that, this whole idea of self-control and what that means and what that looks like when you implement that in your life properly. And and that's when I had brought up the hoe phase, wanting to be a slave to our sexual desires and things like that, as opposed to doing what God commands us, which is to hold that sacred and to hold that aside, set it aside for the person who is going to be your spouse. And I lost you again, and I can't see you.
I know my screen went black, but it's okay. Just keep talking. We'll start. I'm just going to take this as a sign to wrap up.
Yeah. No, yeah, I'll just go on. But yeah, so that's why the institution of marriage protects that. That way you can you get to let loose in that way, but within marriage, within a boundary, and that requires that self-control, to be able to do that. So that's the best example of self-control that I've used in my life, and where it's gotten me. Now I'm, like I said before, like I'm 28 and I'm married to the most wonderful, God-fearing man. I mean, oh my gosh, like this, I could go on, but yeah,
I think, you definitely are married to like an incredible God-fearing man. And just for some context, every man, and I've said this to Alyssa a bunch of times, every guy that Alyssa has been with over the past, 10 years or so since she started dating, I hated every boyfriend she ever had.
Oh, they were the worst.
They were the worst. They were weird. They were just they weren't, I don't know how to explain it. Normal people. I'm sorry, Alyssa. I don't know I don't know what you were doing, but
no, but you know what? And I'll bring that back to having a father in the home, because that's a perfect example of why that is so important, because I cannot imagine where I would be in my life if I didn't have a father to sit me down and go, Alyssa, what the actual hell are you doing with these dudes? Okay. To speak that hard truth into my life, to set that boundary for me, to show me and give me an example of what a good and godly man looks like, so I can see what one does not look like, because like I think back to the dudes that I've dated before, and like it's really weren't all that many. I think it was like three dudes. I don't know. Either way, I would see some aspects of what I thought was of good qualities that I thought were in them, and it was so important to have a father who could go, no, that's not it. And then I'm able to look at that from that perspective and go, oh yeah, you're right. You're right. That ain't it, Chief. That definitely ain't it. And so having that guidance, this is where I'm at today. That was a sidebar. Where were we going with that?
Well, I was going on that same path where I was going to compliment your marriage, because I love your husband. I'm so glad that's the person you ended up with. And you guys are, like I always say, mom and dad, but you're like the example of what you are, just biblically sound through and through. And again, you're everything that I want to be. Like, you're down to the relationship, because it's God-fearing and it's beautiful. And I used to think that it was like, that true love and true relationships and the best kinds of relationships were always like flourishing, just if you were just doing your own thing. But now I see the big picture and I see that order that we keep talking about. I see God's order and I see its necessity in a relationship, because
Yes.
we are, is just to now at this point we're repeating ourselves, but we're emotional beings. We are emotional beings, and that requires some sort of leader within the dynamic. And I so clearly see now how headship is necessary, why men need to be really the head of the household, and that it's not an oppressive thing. It actually allows the woman to be her full self, because she can be feminine and she can be soft and she can be the nurturer and all of the things that women are biologically and biblically designed to be. And it comes from a man who allows her to be that, who allows her to flourish within those parameters. And that comes from him flourishing within the parameters that God gives him, as opposed to just flailing around trying to figure it out by himself. And then he doesn't trust himself. So then his woman doesn't trust him. And then it creates all this dysfunction within the relationship. And then people wonder why the divorce rate is 50%, like you said. It's because there is no God, man, woman, children. It's like God and woman and child. Like it's arbitrary, like you keep saying.
Right. And you know what, that's, I'll go back to the whole idea that, feminism believes that the biblical relationship between a man and a woman is oppressive. It's not just the woman who is held to certain standards. God places a heavy, heavy burden on men. I mean, like the heaviest burden. God does not call women to love their husbands as Christ loved the church. He calls men to that. And that entails such sacrifice and such self-control and such strength to be able to do that. Women don't realize how much of a burden on men that is. And so when we think about, when we're in our little selfish modes and we're thinking, okay, I have to, the Bible calls me to be submissive to my husband. And again, and I'm going to explain what that means and what it doesn't mean in a moment. But, to be submissive to my husband, that's nothing but just setting my ego aside a little bit. That's all that requires of me, is to set my ego aside a little bit in some instances, whereas men, having the burden of that leadership, are called to sacrifice so much more. The burden that my husband has to provide not only for me, but for children as well is immense. Like men, my God, think about the jobs that men have had and have to have throughout history. I think of my father and the way that my father provided for my mom and for my brother and I. He's a firefighter in the city of Philadelphia. That man has seen his life flash before his eyes more times than I can count, more times than he's even cared to tell us, because of how stressful and scary that is. Men putting their lives on the line for their wives, for their children, all just to provide. My own husband, who busts his rear end, providing for me and building the foundations for us to have a family that requires so much sacrifice, mentally, physically. It's just, there's such a burden on them. And for women to, for lack of a better, for women to bitch about that, it's not fair. It really isn't. It's not fair.
But, and this feminist culture has certainly done a really good job at demonizing men in that aspect. And that's something that we don't talk about, is there is an actual burden on men. And, for a man to have all of this responsibility and for him to not know God, he doesn't understand why he feels all this pressure. It's because he's not putting it on Christ where it belongs. He's just trying to use all of it for himself. And then you have that coupled with a world that is telling the man that the woman doesn't need him, that you can do it all on your own. So we have these men that don't know God, and they don't know their place because they don't know God, and because the world is telling them that they don't have a place because women who run the world, like, Beyonce, like it's actually like men are really victimized within this culture, within feminism especially. And people, if you say that, it's like people want to, wag their finger at you and say, how dare you say that? Men have it made, but no, they don't. We are all actually made equal in the image of God. It's just that, we're equal in purpose, but we are like different of purpose. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, no. So there's a term for that. It's complementarianism. This idea that, or rather this biblical idea that men and women, we complement each other. We have equal worth, but different roles, that we are not equal in every sense, in that, like, there are many differences between us. There are biological differences between us. There are even like physiological differences between us, mental differences between us. We've touched on this. Women tend to be the more emotional of, we tend to be more emotional, and that's not a bad thing. Actually, there's a function to that, and it comes into play in raising children. Whereas, men are just built of different stuff, and they're built, and the stuff that they're built of, that's what's required for them to go out and do the hard thing, to conquer what needs to be conquered in order to provide for his family. And that is what gives men purpose. Men in healthy relationships thrive in that. And in turn, their wives, they thrive. And if their wives are thriving, then their children are thriving. And that is what builds that healthy family relationship. It's such a simple equation, and yet we've trashed it. We've trashed it. And now nobody wants to talk about gender roles. Nobody wants to talk about how effective they are. People just kind of want to complain. And now, the family unit is just completely busted. And this is what we've got. We've got fatherlessness. We've got crime. We've got young men who are, they're going nuts, like, I'm going to sidetrack a little bit because this just came to mind. These young men who have literally gone off the deep end and, committed heinous crimes like mass shootings and things like that. What is the common denominator in all of these instances? It's young men who are fatherless. They are directionless. They are just floundering in life, and they become nihilistic. And what happens? They turn to violence. These are the results of stepping outside of God's order, is that you get chaos. And that chaos manifests itself in the world in horrible, horrible ways. And so, order of operations, it's really freaking important.
It really is. And it doesn't marginalize women to like any second class status at all. And it's really the most important point to get across. I don't know how we got like over an hour and a half into this without even touching on that idea of submission. That's crazy. Like, I can't believe we forgot that, but but as we wrap up here, the whole concept of submission, people have like an issue with that. And that's another talking point of how people will say that the Bible is oppressive because, you have to submit to the man, you have to submit to your husband. But again, it just comes back to everything we're saying. It's not like you get married and you just leave your capability of thought or of reason or of
No.
decision making at the altar. That's not what it is. A marriage is a sacred covenant. And it's a lot less about staying in love than it is about honoring the covenant, which is another talk for another day. But, you know, it's not about losing yourself. It's about uniting yourself to another when you get married and submitting to that order. You're submitting to the order. It's not submitting to the man. It's submitting to the order of God.
There is, there is that order of operations. Men, husbands submit to the Lord. Women submit to their husbands. You know, there's submission that's taking place on both sides. And, you know, when you say the word submission, people tend to think that that's, they tend to have like they kind of cringe, you know, like there's like a cringe kind of reaction that's happening. Like there's like a negative connotation to the word, when really, submission is a beautiful thing. It is a dying to self, you know, like I think of, there's I can't remember. I'm so bad at remembering like what Bible verse is in what book, because I have like so many of them just kind of like floating around up in my head. But, you know, like when Jesus calls us to pick up our cross daily, you know, to die to ourselves, you know, that's an act of love, you know, but it also, it's what allows us to live in that freedom, you know? So like, for example, in the sense that women are called to submit to their husbands, we'll go back to this again. Oftentimes women we can be very emotional creatures. We just really can, you know, like if I wake up in the morning and I didn't sleep well and I didn't have my coffee and I'm losing my mind a little bit and I have my husband to, you know, to just calm me down, to sit me down and to speak sense and to speak truth into my life, you know, to be able to submit to that wisdom, you know, to reorient myself, to get myself back on track with the help of my husband is an invaluable gift. It keeps people functional. It keeps people healthy. You know, it keeps people in a correct state of mind. You know, submission is not slavery. Okay. Like we get this idea from feminism that submission is like slavery, you know, like it's like, you know, women get married and suddenly they have to submit to their husbands. And so that means that they're not allowed to have a voice in anything. They're not allowed to have an opinion on anything. They're not allowed to have any kind of freedom. They're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. And that's not the case. You know, it's not the case at all. You know, we submit in many aspects of our lives. We submit in jobs. A lot of people don't want to talk about that. You know, there's submission in doing a job for someone, being in a job. You know, you have things that are expected of you. Your boss tells you that you need to do something. And what do? You submit to that. You follow that and you get it done.
And it's funny.
And then, but when you put that in the context of a marriage, suddenly it's like filthy and horrible.
Right.
Like it's so hypocritical. It's not even funny.
And just in general, when people say that they don't want to submit to God, like aside from the marriage thing, people say they don't want to submit to God. They don't want anything to tell them what to do. They don't want to follow a manual, aka the Bible. They don't want to follow rules. The thing is, though, exactly what you said, you're always submitting to something. You don't want to submit to the Lord, your creator, but you don't submit to your boss that says you can't go on vacation next week because you have to work. And that's fine because it's secular, because it's tangible and it's in front of you. But that's an entirely different conversation.
But it goes along with what we're talking about, you know, like the idea of submitting, submitting to someone else's will, and also, like people have bad ideas all the time, right? Like, I have bad ideas a lot. Okay. And that it's really nice and it's very helpful to be able to go to the man, my husband, who I love and who I trust, and talk about that decision that I want to make, and having somebody who is looking at that from a logical standpoint, but also a standpoint of love, and having my own best interest in mind to go, yeah, that's dumb. Don't do that. Obviously in kinder words, but
and also
with the same thing.
And also with the reason you trust that wisdom is because you know that he trusts God.
Yes, he has a biblical foundation from which that decision came from.
Right. And so, long way around the barn, here we are again saying nuclear families, biblical foundations for the nuclear family is
healthy marriages.
The world would be flourishing right now.
It would be. We could conquer so much, and yet the enemy is out there just wrecking things in any way, shape, and form that he can. That's the sad reality of it, is that we live in this fallen world, and it's not going to be perfect until Jesus Christ himself comes back. And in the meantime, we're fighting a spiritual battle against a force that doesn't want marriages to thrive. He doesn't want, families to stay together. He wants to break families. He wants to break marriages. He wants children to go astray. He wants fathers to abuse their wives and abuse their children, and mothers to abuse their husbands and abuse their children. And it's tragic. I think about when right before I got married, I went through the pastor who married Matt and I, my husband, he said that he would marry us only if we went through some marriage counseling with him. And I thought, well, okay, what could it hurt? At the time, of course, like Matt and I were already, we were both Christians. So obviously we knew what we were getting into, but throughout the course of this marriage counseling, this pastor and his wife were able to really open our eyes to some of the issues that we could potentially face as a married couple, which stem from, the enemy wanting to attack our marriage. A lot of people don't think about that going into marriage, is that, not only is the world against you, or rather, not only is Satan against you, but by extension, the world is against you. And they're going to do everything that they can to ruin that marriage. And so it's so important to go into a marriage with that biblical foundation, because otherwise you are setting yourself up to fail, because we're human and we screw up. And it's so important to be able to pinpoint and look at the things that could potentially be like totally ruinous and avoid them.
100%. We'll do a future episode on marriage.
Oh yeah, that's a whole episode.
Yeah, whole episodes, like 6 episodes. And we'll definitely have you back on in the future, because this is my longest episode, because you and I can just talk for hours like this.
Forever.
Is there any wrap up thoughts that you have regarding feminism, regarding the nuclear family unit, that you want to talk about before we close?
No, but you know what? The only thing that I really think that I want to close with is an encouragement for not only you, but also for all of the other women who have just come out of the new age, brand new believers in Christ, who feel like they have all of this catching up to do, and all of this, all of this cleaning house to do. It is so important, and it is such a testimony it is such a valuable testimony to be able to do that and allow people to see that and follow you on that journey. It's incredible. I think about myself and the way that I was raised, my own faith journey of being a Christian. My journey and it's so much different than yours. I don't have the testimony that you have. You're able to reach people in a way that I might not be able to because of what you've gone through. And God will use that. He is using that. And the evidence of that is this podcast. And so I just want to encourage you and to all of the other women, whoever's watching, no matter where you're at, God is going to use where you're at and where you were for his glory. And it's not too late for that. It's never too late for that.
Amen. Well, thank you so much. Before we get out of here, would you please close us out in a prayer?
Sure. Oh, I would love to. Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you so much for this opportunity that I had to come onto Angela's podcast, Lord, to just take part in this amazing, amazing testimony, Lord, this amazing, just this amazing thing that she's doing, Lord, that you are using in order to reach a whole group of people who are they're so thirsty and they are so hungry for you, Lord. God, I pray that you just continue to bless this podcast, bless this ministry that Angela is taking part in, and bless other people who are in a similar ministry, Lord, that they'll be able to use this to just reach people who are just hungry and just aching for you, Lord. And in your name, I pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Yes, I can't wait to do this again.